Many shooters rely on their gunsmith or even the factory to have the scope mounted on the rifle. Now, although it may be mounted properly to the rifle, there's no guarantee it's actually going to fit you. Now, I like to equate this to buying a top-of-the-line sports car and then never adjusting the mirrors or the seats from their factory positions. You're not going to get the performance you want, no matter how nice the equipment is. Hi, I'm Ryan Cleckner with the National Shooting Sports Foundation. Now, my experience as a sniper team leader in 1st Ranger Battalion and as a sniper instructor has allowed me to see plenty of instances where the scope is mounted correctly to the rifle, but not to the shooter, and we end up having problems because of it. Now, these techniques we're going to talk about to make sure the scope fits you are going to be able to apply to the target shooting and the hunting worlds equally as well. The first thing we need to do is make sure that the firearm is unloaded before we do anything. We look in the chamber, make sure it's clear, make sure there's no magazine inserted, and this rifle is now safe to work with. Now, the first step we're going to do is going to be a little different. We're going to start with the rings on the rifle. We're not going to put them on the scope yet. Now, I have a Picatinny rail on this rifle here, but yours may be different. You may have a Weaver rail, or your rings may go directly to the receiver. The idea here, though, is when the rings get mounted on, if there's any play whatsoever, we need to make sure and have all the slack taken out and have the rings pushed all the way forward before we tighten them down. That way, we're not going to have issues of when the rifle recoils, the rings are going to slide or slip forward. Once the rings are mounted in place, now we can put the scope in. Take your scope and set them in the lower half of the rings. Now, you can work with this scope and do all of these adjustments we're going to talk about without the top of the rings on. However, if you're worried about your scope falling out, you might want to take the tops of the rings and just very lightly put them on. This way, the scope could still easily move back and forth on the rifle, but you don't have to worry about it falling out of the rings and potentially damaging your very expensive scope here. So just a couple turns is all it's going to take to get these tops on. We're not going to worry about snugging them down yet. Now, these adjustments we're going to be making on the scope. The first two things we're going to worry about are the height of the scope and how far the scope is out from our face. So we're going to be able to adjust in and out and up and down on the scope. Now our up and down is going to be a little limited. The objective lens of the scope up here on the front, depending on its size, is going to limit how low we can get the scope. And that's the key. You don't want the scope up too high. You always want to get the scope as low as you can. So getting lower rings may not always be an option if your objective lens doesn't allow it. So if you're as low as you can possibly go and the rifle or the scope won't allow you to go any further, you need to start building up the cheek rest back here to bring your head up so you can get level. Now, when you bring up the cheek rest, there's many things you can use. You can either have an adjustable stock on your rifle, you can add padding yourself, there's a great aftermarket kits, or you can get cheek pieces like these. I highly recommend these. These are very handy. Not only do they give you a little bit of padding for your cheek, they give you that little extra height that you need and some extra storage for tools like we just used, so whenever you're out at the range and you're worried if something came loose, you have it right here with you. So, the first thing we're going to do is put our head on the rifle with our eyes closed. I know you're used to mounting the rifle with your eyes open and therefore moving your head to where you can see through the scope, but that's the problem we're going to fix here. Now, you also need to take into consideration how you're going to be shooting this rifle mostly. If it's going to be in the standing or seated positions, you need to be in those positions to check the fit. But if you're going to be firing a lot in the prone, you need to actually get down on the ground and get in the prone and make sure they fit. The differences between those positions will make actually quite a bit for your positioning on the scope. Now, I can understand your question on, well, what if you want to shoot all those positions? Well, that's fine. I'm just asking that you get in each and every one of those positions to make sure we have a happy medium on the adjustments so the scope at least works well for you in all positions and doesn't fight you in one or the other. When you first take the rifle, the idea is to get on it comfortably. You want to get directly behind the rifle and not have to strain your neck or your shoulders while you're on. You need to take the rifle, put it into your shoulder, and rest your head down where it's comfortable. The idea here is not to have to push your head too far forward or pull it back too much, but just let the full weight of your head down on the stock. Once your head is down, the first thing you're going to do is just open your eyes. If you can see through the scope, you're good. But if you're like me, you're looking right into the bottom edge of the scope. That's a problem. What that's going to make me do when I'm at the range is have to lift my head up and muscle the gun around to try and shoot a good group. That's always going to be a problem because I'm not comfortable and relaxed. Well, and with my rifle setup, I can't get that scope any lower. So I need to start building my head position up. I, for years, have used that foam I talked about. I take the styrofoam, maybe from those old camping sleeping pads. I cut them up in strips and I put them on the buttstock of the rifle and I tape them down. The problem is it's a little unsightly and it comes off after a while. So I finally got tired of having to rebuild them, and I just made my own out of a piece of wood. I took a 1x2, I took out my pocket knife, I shaved the wood off, and I kept setting it on there until it got the position I wanted. When I was done, I taped it up, I put a couple of nails through it, and I drilled 2 holes in my stock. Now that might panic some of you, so if you don't want to do that, this may not fit for everybody. You may want to get an adjustable stock or some other method, but for me it worked. And I take this and I can put this on each time in the same 2 holes. Now here's a note to be careful of. If you're building something up on your stock, always be sure that the action can clear. If you're not careful, you might end up building something up, getting a perfect fit with your scope on your rifle, and then not even be able to use your rifle. So always be sure that the action clears whatever you're adding on. And like my setup here is, it's removable. So that way when I go to clean my rifle, I can actually take the bolt out and not have to worry about what's behind it. So for me, this piece of wood and the cheek rest, when I put both of these on, I can put the full weight of my head down on the rifle, open my eyes, and I can see perfectly through the scope. Now, you might be wondering how you can see perfectly through a scope. I mean, if you see through it, you see through it. But there's actually an alignment that's going on with that scope that you need to be aware of. That black ring, that fuzzy shadow that you see that we call scope shadow, that's actually helpful. Not when you're shooting, but it helps to make sure that your scope's aligned properly. See, we all know that with iron sights, that sight alignment is important and then sight picture on the target. Well, the same is true with a scope, and some people just don't know it. They just look at the reticle, place it on the target, and then shoot. Well, that scope shadow that's in this scope lets me know when I'm not looking perfectly centered through that scope. So it's very helpful. But when you're first getting this set up, it might be a little frustrating. So if you have an adjustable power scope like this is, always be sure to turn it to low power first. That way your tolerances are going to be as wide as possible and you'll be able to get set up. But just remember that you're on low power, and once you think you have a good setting, always turn it to high power to check. And that's going to bring that scope shadow in quite a bit to make sure you're dead in the center. Now, once we have the height figured out, now we can worry about the front to back. All you need to do is look through the scope like normal, and then move the scope forward and back until the scope shadow is all the way gone. Don't move your head. That's the idea we're trying to fix here. Put your head on the scope, on the rifle, move the scope forward and back until it's just where it needs to be, and you see no scope shadow. Now, this is actually handy if you have a friend helping you, because you can just be laying on the ground and they can move the scope for you to make sure it's clear. Now, once it's good front to back, and it's good up and down, we can go ahead and tighten the scope down, but we need to level it first. Now there's plenty of aftermarket tools to level scopes out there. Some snap onto this bottom base here, they have levels on them and lines to line up the reticle. There's systems for using on the wall, and I'm sure they all work fine. For me, I like a simpler system, which is either one, making sure the rifle's completely level, and then putting a level on top of my flat scope cap if you have one, and making sure it's level. But again, be sure that the rifle's level first, because a level scope on a crooked rifle doesn't do anybody any good. But my favorite method is when I have a scope like this Leopold here with the flat bottom on it, I have a flat bottom to the scope and a flat rail. So I can take any piece of metal that has 2 flat edges on it that are parallel to each other, and I can reach down underneath the scope. I can line the piece of metal flat on the rail and tilt it so the other side touches the bottom of the scope base and actually just tilts and levels the scope on its own. If the scope is tilted one way or the other at all, you'll see light through it easily and know that it's not level. Once it's level, you can pull that tool out, take your wrench, and start tightening the scope rings. Now, don't get carried away. When you tighten these down, again, we're just going to go finger tight. And we want to keep a little bit of a gap on one side of the rings. If you notice, the rings won't go perfectly flush on both sides. You're going to have them tilted one way or the other, so we want to keep them right in the middle and try and keep an even gap between both sides. Once you do that and you get them just finger tightened down, you can go ahead and snug them down all the way. Now, if you don't have a torque wrench handy and you're just out at the range and you happen to have your tool with you, the rule of thumb I like to go by is I take the short end of the Allen wrench for leverage, and that's all I grab onto. Then I tighten those little screws down as tight as I can get with that short little piece of leverage. And then I tighten them in an X fashion, almost like I'm changing a tire. Once I get everything tightened down, I actually go back and take them all back out again, but I just do it one at a time. I will take my time to take one screw out, all the way, leaving the other screws just fine, and I put a small drop of blue, which is the non-permanent Loctite on this, and then put it back in. And I'll do that for each and every one of the screws once they're in there to make sure the scope stays put. The last thing you want is to do all this work and be out on a hunting trip with an important shot and have the scope come loose, because it's just not going to work for you. Once this is all set up, this already is better than you may have had because the rifle and the scope fit you better. However, there's still one more adjustment that some people overlook. They don't realize that the reticle inside this scope can actually be focused to your eye specifically. Now see, parallax is a popular topic now with scopes, and you have parallax adjustments on many scopes here. And the idea being is we take the image of the target, which is on a certain focal plane inside the scope, and the image of the reticle, and by adjusting the parallax, we get them on that same focal plane, so that if our eye moves, the image moves together. Where if you don't adjust the parallax, the images don't move together, and we end up having troubles. Well, it doesn't do any good to bring that target image onto the reticle image if you don't know that your eye is set up for the reticle image already. On this scope, we're going to be able to adjust that by moving this ocular housing. This scope has a locking ring right here that we're going to turn away from the housing. We might need to turn the two together to get them apart. And you're going to take that locking ring and turn it all the way out so that we have all the adjustment allowable in this ocular housing. Now, this is also a handy spot to have a friend help you out. What you do is get behind the rifle and get looking through the scope just like we just talked about to make sure that you're relaxed, you can see right through the center of the scope. But you're going to close your eyes. And then you're going to open them and look only at the reticle, and I want the immediate first sense impression you see when you see that reticle. Even a second later, your eyes are going to adjust and focus on that reticle. So to help this out, it actually is handy to do it inside. Look at a plain white wall. Look at the sky outside if you need to, but we don't want your eye distracted by anything like a target frame or trees or anything that you might try and focus on instead. After you get that first sense impression, you're going to close your eyes again. You're going to take the housing and then turn it a couple turns one direction. You're going to open your eyes and look at that reticle again. And all we need to know is if it's better or worse than it was the last time. Close your eyes, a couple more turns, and again. By going through the entire adjustment range of this ocular housing, you're going to be able to find that middle section where it was the clearest for you. Get back to that, and then you can fine-tune with small turns and get in the middle of the range where the reticle is clear to your eye. This way, every time you take this rifle and you put your head down on the stock, not only are you going to be able to see through the scope, but you're going to be able to see that reticle nice and clear. So then, when we adjust our parallax and we have targets of different distances and we want to move that range in and out, we're actually bringing that target image into a zone that we know is actually set up for your eye right there with the reticle. And you're going to have a lot better success with that. Well, now that your scope's mounted properly, it's adjusted forward and back, the up and down works, and the scope, after you're done, is adjusted for your reticle. You need to go out to the range and try it out and see how it works for you. I think you're going to be pretty pleased with the results. If you need to find a place to shoot, feel free to check out our website at wheretoshoot.org. And remember, firearm safety starts with you.